Byron York joins me because I want him to do his hurricane projection for campaign 2024. There are a lot of places it can go, Byron, right? The map is all over the place. Where's the cone in your view?
That's a great question. I was listening to your conversation with David, and I remember in 2008 the John McCain Mike Huckabee Buddy Act that in which they were trying to bring down Mitt Romney. I had forgotten how far Romney was ahead at this point. In
the West Virginia
race.
Convention. Remember the West Virginia Convention? That was really wildly cooperative between McCain and Huckabee.
In Iowa, at this point in 2007, Mitt Romney had a 16-point lead.
Wow.
Okay, so it was, like I say, bigger than I remembered. Now, today in Iowa, Donald Trump has a 28-point lead. In New Hampshire, he has a 31-point lead. In South Carolina, he also has a 31-point lead. So it's bigger than that, and then bigger than what Romney had. And then your question with Dave is can anybody form any two candidates form a strategic alliance and try to get Trump out? It's just kind of hard to do. In Iowa, DeSantis is still a strong number two. He's 8 points ahead of Tim Scott. Iowa is Tim Scott's best state right now, and so he's in third place, and he's actually about 4 points ahead of Ramaswamy and Haley, and then everybody else. So it's hard to see which two candidates could form the strategic alliance. Will Hurd and Binkley. I don't know. That would bring down
Byron,
Donald Trump.
I don't have a scenario. I'm pretty good at cooking up scenarios, but the reality is, if people don't drop out, Donald Trump is the nominee. Is that not the reality?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the other thing to remember, and I've written this occasionally, is that this is everybody has wait to see if something happens strategy. That's all they're doing right now. They cannot see a way in which Donald Trump loses his lead, but they think it could be possible through a series of events that they cannot predict right now. And if it does happen, they want to be in the position to benefit and to take the nomination when Trump collapses or just declines. And the thing is that in terms of scheduled events, what events are scheduled between now and the Iowa caucuses? Well, it's basically just debates and a bunch of cattle calls that will attract a lot of candidates. So you think to yourself, well, okay, the first debate in which Trump is on stage with the others, could that have a determinative effect on this race? Well, probably not, but it might help Trump. And I can't see any debate, any event right now that's scheduled, that's predicted, that would do that before Trump goes before the voters on January the 15th.
Byron, I had a tech subscriber upset with me because I declared that I believe, given President Biden's obvious infirmity, that a convicted and confined Donald Trump would beat Joe Biden. And they were very upset with me. I don't know if they're never Trump or not. But I do believe a convicted and confined Donald Trump. Because I talked to Donald Trump for an hour last week, and he's not Joe Biden. Joe Biden doesn't talk to anybody for an hour. He talked to MSNBC for a half hour, Stephanie, for like 20 minutes of a half an hour. And he had to get up and leave. He can't do it.
The other factor I was going to mention is it going to matter when Trump actually goes on trial? March 4th, right before Super Tuesday, the January 6th and the 2020 election trial starts in Washington. Then in March, the documents trial starts in Florida, and then later the other trial, the 2016 trial in New York. and the Georgia trial is kind of a wild card right now. So are any of them actually going to matter? And they might. I mean, they actually might. I'm not saying they don't, because the one thing about indictments right now is that Trump is standing defiant in front of these indictments, but he's not. He did have to be arraigned. He had to plead, and then nothing has happened publicly. When trials come, he has to actually sit there and be on trial. That may infuriate his supporters even more, and actually increase or at least harden his support.
So if I look at the cone,
it might have the opposite.
I agree with you. And by the way, after last week's interview, I am convinced he's going to lean into this the entire way. He is going to absolutely lean into everything the entire way. And people missed some of it where he said, there's no plea deal they could offer me that I'd accept. I'm not going to take it. They missed a lot of his appeal. And I think it's becoming a very unusual, I don't think it's dangerous, I just think it's unusual, a countryside versus the Capitol election. And if I look at the cone says Biden-Trump, and the cone says Trump wins. There are variables all over the place, but that's what I think, Byron. If I might change my bet on the next Brett Baer candidate casino, because it just seems to me that nobody's dropping out.
No, and I wrote not long after the debate that we were really down to 5 or 4 candidates. But Asa Hutchinson has to go, and Burgum has to go, and some and if Tim Scott doesn't really show up at the next debate, I know he's got a lot of money, but he's really not doing great at the moment.
Vice President Pence is not surging.
Vice President Pence is not surging, and he just has a fatal contradiction at the heart of his campaign, which is that he's running against and with his record, as Donald Trump's vice president. I mean, it's just an incredibly difficult situation.
But if he gets out, he could be the Secretary of State for a new president not named Trump if he throws his prestige, which is significant. And he's a genuine conservative, behind somebody. But if you're looking at the governor of Florida, Governor DeSantis, Ambassador Haley, Vivek, former President Trump, on a stage, you've got a real chance of something happening. But if you add even Tim Scott in there, it begins to get confused. And if Tim Scott is running for vice president, he has no incentive to leave, right?
No, and he has a ton of money. Larry Ellison, the tech billionaire, has given $20+ million to super PACs supporting Tim Scott. So he can really stay in for a long time. But a lot of, Michael Bloomberg could have stayed in for a long time, too. And even when a candidate has a lot of money, if he's not just setting anything on fire, then sooner or later he has to get out.
Yeah, right now there are incentives. In fact, I'd love you to stick around, if you can, for an additional segment, Byron, because I want to talk to you about the incentives. People have incentives to stay in a race. They have lots of different incentives aside from winning. What is Tim Scott's incentive to stay in if his numbers are not moving into double digits?
Well, almost every candidate who runs for president ends up with a higher stature after having run than before the run. That just, you were talking about Mike Huckabee earlier. I mean, look at him, a former governor of Arkansas, and I don't know where he would have been today had he not run for president and won the Iowa caucuses in January 28th. Worked out, had a big popular show on Fox, which he gave up to run for president again in 2016. But he really ended up in a much better place, more prominent place, more money, more exposure, book deals, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I want people to stick, if you can, Byron, stick around, because I want to talk about Vivek's incentives. I want to talk about Governor Christie's incentives and Nikki Haley's. Ron DeSantis is playing to win, as is, I think, Ambassador Haley. I'm not sure the others are, and they have incentives not to leave. And that's what I want people to understand objectively. Byron and I are just trying to get the cone right. That's it. We're just Jim Cantori doubles on a political show. Byron York is a Fox News contributor with the Washington Examiner. Byron, I'm going to keep you a couple of segments because we got so much to do. I'm going to come back to the candidates in a moment. Former President Trump tweeted this morning. So let's get this straight. Didn't tweet. He put it on Truth Social, got picked up. So let's get this straight. We, meaning America, did a hostage trade in caps with Iran. We gave them 5 very tough, smart people that they desperately wanted. We likewise got back 5 people, but in caps. We also gave them $6 billion. How much of a kickback does crooked Joe Biden get? Does anyone realize how much $6 billion is? When I was president, I got back 58 hostages for 0 money in caps. Remember Pastor Brunson? It sets a terrible precedent. Republicans call out the 25th Amendment now. Biden is incompetent. What do you think, Byron?
Well, it's been known from the very beginning that Biden and perhaps more importantly the people around him were desperate to have another deal with Iran, the one that Trump threw out. And the money, as I understand it, is Iranian money that the U.S. froze. So Biden is giving Iran its money back, which Iran has really, really, really wanted. But it's not, $6 billion new U.S. dollars we're giving to them. But still, I don't see how you see this as anything other than kind of a victory for Iran. And is it a Hail Mary? It's some sort of strategic victory inside the Biden administration for the people who are pressing for a new deal.
Now, here is what I think is the most important part about this. Donald Trump is out punching hard. And I think it's appeasement. I think it's a terrible idea. And I've talked to hostage negotiators for years. It gives Iran incentives to take more Americans. That's all it does. And the $6 billion they get, it's like Sam Bankman-Fried getting $6 billion back. They're terrible terrorist regime. But one way or the other, Trump is punching hard this morning. He's getting attention. And Joe Biden can't punch back. He invented a 9/11 visit yesterday, a 9/12 visit to the looking into the gates of hell. What are the Democrats thinking, Byron? I know you talked to them. What are they thinking about this?
Well, there's a couple of strains of thought. One, that they're obviously worried. I mean, the president is too old to be president. He's frail. He appears confused. He rambles. All those things that you and I and everybody who's listening to this can see with their own eyes every day. On the other hand, there's a significant group inside them who are saying, Biden is the most accomplished president ever. And I mean, look at what Gavin Newsom, who wants the job, said the other day. Joe Biden's presidency has been a master class in accomplishing things. And listen to the New York Times lead from yesterday of the trip. Quote, in 3 days of diplomacy in Asia, President Biden rallied world leaders to help finance poor nations, fortified the coalition backing Ukraine, and struck a deal with Vietnam to counter Chinese aggression. But even before he left Vietnam on Sunday night, the president was hammered with a very different narrative, that being conservative media outlets seizing, yes, they use the word seizing, on his end-of-trip news conference. Okay, so the idea was President Biden has shown what a great statesman he is, and once again, conservative media seize on just a moment's stumbling to change the narrative from Biden's great accomplishments.
Byron, my listeners in Cleveland, Ohio, will recognize the name Captain Penny. It's for preschool kids back in the day. And he used to close every program by saying, you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool Mom. And I believe about Joe Biden, you can fool some of the people some of the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool voters. You just can't. I don't care if the New York Times, I don't care if the Beltway Manhattan narrative is Joe Biden could win the decathlon. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. And the other problem is, one, aging is something that every human being is familiar with. If they're a young person, they have an older relative. If they're getting old themselves, they see what's going on. Everybody can see what is happening with Biden. And aging is a one-way street. It doesn't get better. And so, I think I was thinking this morning before I went on that a year from now will be in the last 2 months of the campaign. It would be extremely intense at that time. we'll see how Joe Biden performs.
I don't think he's going to be the nominee. I really don't. Byron's going to stick around because we're going to go through the incentives of every Republican candidate. I'm going to drive down to New Hampshire today to see Chris Christie at a town hall, and I want to talk through it with Byron. He's being very patient with me today, but we both occupy the same Jim Cantore position in the political world. We're just trying to figure it out, right? We don't have a position. We're just trying to figure it out. Byron York has stayed with me because we want to dial in and use Byron's expertise on the Republican primary. Byron, here are my assumptions going in. I want you to challenge them, walk through it. That Ron DeSantis is in second place, and he's not going anywhere. Chris Christie is in second place or first place in New Hampshire above the contenders. He's behind Donald Trump. Nikki Haley is in second place in Iowa. They're not going anywhere. Tim Scott is not doing much, but he's got a lot of money. And Vivek is just having a ball. Let's go through them. Am I right about Ron DeSantis? He's not going anywhere.
I think you are, yes.
All the way through Super Tuesday.
Well, no, not necessarily all the way through Super Tuesday. I mean, you've got to do pretty well in the Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina thing. You just have to. If he fails to catch on in that time, I don't know that he actually continues.
And that's only Iowa, right? I mean, if we were to look at today's polling, you get an Iowa bump, but you don't get that much of a bump. Then you're eating into Chris Christie and Nikki Haley.
I kind of look at it, if you wouldn't mind, I kind of look at it going from the bottom up.
Okay.
Okay. The low hanging fruit. If you add Larry Elder, Doug Burgum, Asa Hutchinson, and Will Hurd, add them together, you get 1.6%.
Correct.
Of the vote. Okay, so obviously, I mean, they should go now. Okay, they shouldn't really be in the second debate. And each of them, by the way, what I was saying earlier, will end up in a higher place than they were before they ran for president. We could talk about that. But so it will have been a benefit to them. They should go now. But then the next person you get to is Tim Scott.
Vice President Pence. Vice President Pence.
Well, I'm going up the 2024 polls, but if you want to get Pence, I've been writing. I think Pence is in a fatally contradicted position, and it just doesn't work for him.
He's going to leave the stage at some point before Super Tuesday.
Yes.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim Scott does have this money, but I mentioned Bloomberg before. At some point, if you're just going nowhere, money doesn't really keep you in the race.
What are his incentives, Byron? What are his incentives?
What are his incentives? He's the one, does he want to run for governor of South Carolina? Does he want to stay in through South Carolina? Does he want to win the two-person South Carolina primary with Nikki Haley? I don't know. It seems to me that if Haley keeps doing well and pulls ahead in the South Carolina the South Carolina internal primary between just Haley and Scott, the two South Carolinians running, that I don't think he has a lot of incentive to stay in.
What's the downside for Tim Scott to stay in?
Well, the downside is always the same, in which you seem to be irrelevant and don't matter anymore.
Damage to your future, right?
You're just
damage to your
around.
Future. Why didn't Tom Cotton run? Why didn't Mike Pompeo run? Because they see political futures and they don't want to damage them.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, those are two really interesting guys because they ran pretty hard for a while.
Yep.
And they were really exploring and they were really thinking about it. And they both decided it was time to spend more time with their families, which I think is an interesting take on this. And my guess is, I haven't spoken to them about their decision. Each of them is pretty happy with what they've decided.
I agree. Now, what about Governor Christie? I think he has the clearest path forward here. He's going to New Hampshire. He's on an ideological
mission. He's on an ideological mission that is not really determined by support. It's like if he's in front of a crowd and he starts attacking Donald Trump and they boo him, and he'll just say, "Well, the truth hurts." So
can the metrics work? I mean, can the RNC keep him off of the stage? I mean, they're not trying to. They're being very fair, but they keep raising the metrics. Can he keep meeting the metrics?
Well, there's a certain part of the Republican Party that really is not just open to another candidate other than Trump, but wants Trump to go. and he's giving them their voice right now. And right now, he has, in the national polls I'm looking at, he has more than Tim Scott does.
Yep.
And certainly more than all the other.
He's in second place behind Trump in New Hampshire.
Yeah, so he's got enough to hang his hat on to stay there because he's delivering this message. Now, on the other hand, if you listen to him very much, he's hung his whole campaign on some great confrontation with Donald Trump, in which I guess Christie thinks he can just punch Trump in the nose hard enough and he'll bring him down. So if there's this big confrontation on a debate stage, and it doesn't really work well for Christie, then he actually loses a lot of his rationale for running.
Let's talk about Vivek now. I expect Ramaswamy to be back on the show soon because he likes to talk. Yesterday, he got on with Stuart Varney, and he declared the 14th Amendment does not confer birthright citizenship. That's been asked and answered for a long time. What is Vivek doing in here? What are his incentive sets right now?
Well, at first I thought his incentive sets. I was going to bring up the person of Andrew Yang, who nobody heard of before he ran for president in the Democratic primary in 2020, which was a 20-plus candidate primary. Now he's pushing a new book. He was just on Good Morning America this week, and there's a story in Politico that he hasn't closed the door on no labels. So he's in a higher place than he was before he ran. Ramaswamy is definitely in a higher place than he was before he ran. But I think what we've seen after the debate was he really gets a lot of attention. People notice him. Some of them really, really like him, but he turns off a fair amount of people, too. His appeal is really double-edged because he does alienate some portion of the people who listen to him.
You know, as I watch his rise, I conclude that whoever is the nominee, most likely President Trump, just based on the numbers right now, they should pick a generational change in the way that Ike picked Nixon. And I don't care if it's a female or a minority, just somebody under the age of 45 and probably a combat veteran. I've got a short list of Tom Cotton and Mike Gallagher, and there are others, obviously, who depends on who the nominee is. But that's what Vivek is writing. He's the young, smart guy who's kind of savvy about everything.
Yeah, but you have to remember, in this race with Biden and Trump, all the other candidates, a 60-year-old candidate represents generational change. When the leading candidates are so old, a candidate who's actually in the older range of presidential candidates represents generational change. So you don't have to go to a 38-year-old candidate. Even Mike Pence could qualify. Certainly Nikki Haley, who's in her 50s, could qualify. DeSantis in his 40s would qualify as generational change. You don't have to go to somebody who's just barely old enough constitutionally to be president. Everybody's a generational change other than Trump and Biden.
So neither of us believe that it's very plausible that either Chris Christie or Vivek Ramaswamy will be the nominee, correct?
Oh, no. Not a chance.
Let's get to the plausibles. I mean, it's very plausible that Donald Trump is the nominee, but it's not implausible that Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis is the nominee, is it?
That's correct. I mean, you have to think of a Trump collapse scenario, whether it's a quick collapse or a slow collapse. You can say it's extremely unlikely, but, all sorts of accidents are extremely unlikely and do happen. So you actually have to plan for it. And my guess is those would be the two beneficiaries of it.
And so of those two, their incentives are to stay doing what they're doing. There isn't any other incentive here, is there?
No. I mean, DeSantis is running for president. And, when Haley kicked off her race in South Carolina, a lot of people said she's running for vice president. I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Running for president.
Let me play you a clip of her last night in Iowa, cut number 15.
It is time for a new generational conservative leader.
What do you think, Byron? I think she's picking up the idea that she can win.
Yeah, that's exactly what she said in her announcement speech in North Charleston. That's exactly what she said. And she says it all the time. And it's a really compelling argument And, going back to our conversation in the last segment, Joe Biden is just going to get older. He's going to turn 81 on November 20th. It's a compelling argument. Republicans don't really like to face it about Donald Trump because Trump is so clearly more vigorous than Biden is. But you're betting on a president at the end of 4 years. So you're betting on President Trump at 82 years old. Generational arguments. Why are we having this?
I don't know, and it's dangerous for the country. Last question, Byron. When we're in this position, every one of these candidates we've talked about, Governor DeSantis, Ambassador Haley, Governor Christie, Vivek, Tim Scott, all of them can end the race by endorsing Donald Trump. I really believe it's sort of like when Chris Christie endorsed Donald Trump. I was in the studio at ABC this week when he went on with George Stephanopoulos and said, I'm endorsing Donald Trump. Jaw-dropping, changed everything. Trump was already ahead, was probably going to win anyway, but he sealed it. Do you see any of them doing that? Just doing a deal with Mar-a-Lago.
Well, when you saw at the first debate, Brett Baier and Martha McCallum asked how many would continue to support Trump or support the nominee of the party. They all raised their hands. They actually all said so in order to get into the debate. So if after the first three primaries, Trump is just inevitable, they're going to support him. Obviously, Chris Christie won't. Mike Pence won't. He's moved really into the anti-Trump camp now. And a few won't, but those bigger ones will support him because they're Republicans. And they maybe I don't know if Haley wants to run again in 28, but certainly Ron DeSantis might think about it.
I just think the incentives for them, for one of them, not all of them,
from day one. By the way,
what's that?
Because Trump will be a lame duck from day one,
right?
So that changes a lot of the dynamics.
They all have an incentive to be the first person to endorse Donald Trump among the serious candidates, don't they?
This is more difficult than Chris Christie doing it in 2016. This is just more difficult because Trump's on trial. It's easier not to say something. It's easier not to endorse if the candidate's actually on trial. So it's a scenario nobody actually imagined in 2016.
Byron York, thank you for indulging me. It's just so complicated right now, and so many different factors at work. It's where the RNC has tried to be fair to everybody, and they have been fair to everybody. And so Byron and I are doing the same thing. We're just trying to tell you where the cone's going. And there's a big cone possibility out there.